They called Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez a liability who couldn't handle real combat. What they didn't know was that she was about to expose the cover-up that got 12 of her brothers-in-arms killed in Afghanistan. The morning air at Fort Blackwood carried the familiar scent of diesel fuel and desert dust, even though they were stationed in North Carolina. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez stood near the equipment shed at 0530 hours, watching the sunrise paint the obstacle course in shades of amber and gold. Her combat boots were polished to regulation shine, her ACU uniform pressed with military precision, but the name tape on her chest might as well have been invisible for all the attention it commanded from her fellow soldiers. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Elena had been assigned to the 3rd Infantry Division's Logistics Battalion for 18 months, ever since her return from her second deployment to Afghanistan. The official record showed a successful tour as a convoy security specialist, but what they didn't document were the nightmares that still jolted her awake at 0300, the hypervigilance that made her catalog every exit in every room, or the way her hands still trembled slightly when helicopters flew overhead during training exercises. Major Richard Blackstone commanded Bravo Company with the kind of swagger that came from never having seen actual combat. His uniform was always immaculate, his boots mirror bright, and his office walls decorated with commendations for training exercises and administrative achievements. At 38, he was older than most company commanders, a career officer who had somehow managed to avoid deployment during 15 years of active warfare. His voice carried the authority of rank, but Elena had learned to recognize the hollow ring of someone who had never faced enemy fire. "Vasquez," Major Blackstone called from across the motor pool, his voice cutting through the morning chatter of soldiers preparing for the day's training. "My office. Now." Elena secured her clipboard and walked across the gravel lot, her pace measured and professional. She had learned early in her military career that sudden movements or displays of emotion only provided ammunition for those looking to find fault. The door to the company headquarters building squeaked on its hinges as she entered, the sound echoing through corridors lined with motivational posters and unit photographs. Major Blackstone's office occupied a corner of the building, its windows offering a view of the parade ground where fresh recruits stumbled through close-order drill. His desk was positioned to ensure that anyone entering would have to approach from a position of disadvantage, looking up at him seated behind polished mahogany that seemed oddly expensive for government issue. "Close the door," he commanded without looking up from the paperwork spread before him. Elena complied, noting the way he made her wait while he finished reading whatever document held his attention. It was a power play she had seen countless times before, the small assertion of dominance that insecure leaders use to remind subordinates of their place. "Sir, Staff Sergeant Vasquez reporting as ordered," she announced, coming to attention with practiced precision. Blackstone finally looked up, his pale blue eyes scanning her uniform for any minor infraction he might exploit. Finding none, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands across his stomach, which was beginning to show the soft evidence of too many desk assignments and not enough field time. "Vasquez, I've been reviewing your file," he began, tapping a manila folder with one finger. "2 deployments to Afghanistan, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart, Combat Action Badge. Very impressive on paper." Elena remained at attention, sensing the approaching criticism hidden behind his false praise. She had learned to recognize the particular tone officers used when they were about to deliver bad news wrapped in bureaucratic language. "However," Blackstone continued, "I'm concerned about some reports I've been receiving about your adjustments since returning from overseas. Other soldiers have mentioned that you seem jumpy, easily startled. Some have questioned whether you're fit for continued service in a combat-ready unit." The accusation hit Elena like a physical blow, but her expression remained neutral. She had spent months working with the base counselor, participating in group therapy sessions, and following every recommendation from the medical staff. Her last fitness report had been exemplary, and she had qualified expert on her most recent weapons test. Yet here was her commanding officer suggesting that her combat experience somehow made her less capable rather than more valuable. "Sir, I believe my performance record speaks for itself," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. "I have consistently exceeded standards in all areas of evaluation." Blackstone waved his hand dismissively, as if her actual performance was irrelevant to his assessment. Numbers on a scorecard don't tell the whole story, Sergeant. Leadership requires judgment calls about the overall readiness and reliability of personnel. I'm recommending you for transfer to a support role that might be better suited to your current condition. Elena felt her jaw clench, despite her efforts to remain professional. The current condition he referred to was the invisible wounds that every combat veteran carried, the price paid for serving in harm's way, while people like Blackstone advanced their careers from behind safe desks. The recommendation for transfer was essentially career suicide, a gentle way of pushing her toward the exit without the messy complications of a formal medical board review. "Sir, I respectfully disagree with that assessment," Elena said, choosing her words carefully. "I believe I can continue to contribute effectively to this unit's mission readiness." "That's not your decision to make," Blackstone snapped, his facade of concerned leadership slipping to reveal the petty tyranny underneath. "I'm the commanding officer here, and I decide who belongs in my company. Frankly, Sergeant, I think you're a liability. Combat stress cases have a tendency to crack under pressure, and I won't have that endangering the soldiers under my command." The irony of his statement was not lost on Elena. Here was an officer who had never heard a shot fired in anger, questioning the stability of someone who had spent 24 months in combat zones. She had pulled wounded soldiers from burning vehicles, coordinated medical evacuations under enemy fire, and led convoys through some of the most dangerous terrain in Afghanistan. Yet in Major Blackstone's assessment, those experiences made her less qualified to serve, not more. "Sir, I have never failed to complete an assigned mission or compromise the safety of my fellow soldiers," Elena stated firmly. "My combat record demonstrates reliability under the most challenging conditions possible." Blackstone stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward on its wheels. He moved to the window and stared out at the training grounds, his hands clasped behind his back, in a pose Elena recognized as borrowed from war movies rather than developed through actual leadership experience. "Sergeant, you're missing the bigger picture here," he said without turning around. "This isn't about your past performance. It's about your future utility to this organization. The Army is evolving, focusing more on technological solutions and less on the kind of primitive warfare you experienced overseas. We need soldiers who can adapt to modern challenges, not those who are stuck reliving past conflicts." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach as she began to understand the true nature of Blackstone's hostility. He wasn't concerned about her mental health or combat readiness. He was threatened by her experience, intimidated by the authority that came from having actually done the job he was pretending to understand. Her bronze star and purple heart were constant reminders of his own inadequacy, visible proof that his subordinate had accomplished things he never would. "Furthermore," Blackstone continued, finally turning to face her, "I've heard concerning reports about your tendency to question established procedures and protocols. Several soldiers have mentioned that you've been critical of our current training methods, suggesting changes based on your so-called field experience." Now Elena understood the real source of the problem. During recent training exercises, she had privately shared observations with fellow soldiers about gaps between their preparation and the realities of deployment. When the unit practiced convoy operations using outdated tactics that she knew would get people killed in actual combat, she had quietly suggested improvements. When she noticed safety violations during weapons training that mirrored mistakes she had seen cost lives overseas, she had mentioned them to the responsible non-commissioned officers. What she had intended as constructive input based on hard-earned experience, Major Blackstone had interpreted as insubordination and criticism of his leadership. Rather than recognizing her knowledge as a valuable resource, he saw it as a threat to his authority and competence. "Sir, any suggestions I've made have been intended solely to improve the readiness and safety of our soldiers," Elena explained. "My only concern has been ensuring that personnel receive the best possible preparation for potential deployment." "That's exactly the problem," Blackstone replied, returning to his seat with obvious satisfaction at having identified the core issue. "You seem to think your experience gives you the right to second-guess established procedures and approved training protocols. That kind of attitude undermines unit cohesion and command authority." Elena realized she was facing an impossible situation. Her combat experience, which should have been valued as a crucial asset, was being reframed as a liability that threatened the status quo. Major Blackstone had built his career on managing peacetime operations and bureaucratic processes, areas where he possessed genuine competence. The prospect of soldiers learning from someone who had actually performed their mission in combat conditions exposed the limitations of his leadership and the artificial nature of his authority. The meeting ended with Elena being formally notified of her pending transfer to a supply clerk position at a reserve training facility in rural Georgia. As she walked back across the motor pool, she noticed several soldiers watching her with expressions that ranged from sympathy to curiosity. Word of her demotion would spread quickly through the unit, serving as a warning to others who might consider challenging established procedures or questioning command decisions. But Elena Vasquez had survived 2 combat deployments by learning to observe details that others missed, to recognize patterns that revealed hidden dangers, and to trust her instincts when official explanations didn't match observed reality. As she reflected on the conversation with Major Blackstone, certain inconsistencies began to stand out with uncomfortable clarity. Elena's reassignment to inventory duties meant spending her days in the cavernous warehouse that housed everything from spare vehicle parts to surplus field equipment. The building smelled of metal polish and cardboard, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows between towering shelves of military supplies. Most soldiers would have seen this as punishment duty, mind-numbing work designed to encourage voluntary separation from the service. But Elena had learned patience during long hours on convoy duty, and she used the solitude to think. The warehouse contained more than current inventory. Entire sections were devoted to returned equipment from recent deployments, gear that had been shipped back from Afghanistan and Iraq as units rotated home. Damaged vehicles awaiting repair, electronic equipment tagged for refurbishment, and boxes of personal effects from soldiers who hadn't made it home alive. Elena found herself drawn to these forgotten corners, places where the real story of recent conflicts lay gathering dust. It was during her 3rd week of warehouse duty that Elena discovered the first anomaly. She was conducting a routine inventory of communications equipment when she found a sealed container marked with the designation of the 2nd Battalion, 82nd Airborne Division. The accompanying paperwork indicated the equipment had been returned following a mission in Kandahar province 6 months earlier, but the dates didn't match Elena's memory of deployment schedules. Heewal. Elena had maintained unofficial contact with several soldiers from the 82nd through social media and veteran support groups. She knew that the 2nd Battalion had been scheduled to return to Fort Bragg in March, but this equipment manifest was dated 2 months later. The discrepancy might have been simple administrative error, but Elena's combat experience had taught her that small inconsistencies often revealed larger problems. She began paying closer attention to the returned equipment, noting serial numbers and cross-referencing them with deployment records she could access through official channels. What she discovered was troubling. Multiple shipments from the same battalion showed similar date discrepancies, suggesting that equipment had been returned from Afghanistan weeks or months after the unit's official redeployment. Elena's investigation led her to classified after-action reports filed in the warehouse's administrative section. Normally, such documents would be far above her clearance level, but her new assignment included organizing files for digital archiving. As she scanned documents for proper classification and storage, she encountered references to operations that didn't appear in any official record she could find. One report mentioned a reconnaissance mission conducted by elements of the 2nd Battalion in a region that had supposedly been cleared of enemy activity months earlier. Another referenced equipment recovery operations in areas where no American forces were officially stationed. The language was bureaucratic and vague, but Elena's trained eye recognized the patterns of military operations disguised as routine activities. The breakthrough came when Elena found a personal journal buried among the effects of Sergeant Michael Torres, a soldier from the 82nd who had been killed in action 5 months earlier. The journal wasn't supposed to be there. Personal items were typically returned to families immediately after processing. But Torres's belongings had been misfiled among general equipment returns, probably due to clerical error. Elena knew she shouldn't read private correspondence, but something about the circumstances felt wrong. The official casualty report listed Torres as killed during a routine patrol near Bagram Airfield, a relatively secure area where American casualties had become rare. Yet the journal told a different story entirely. Torres wrote about being ordered to participate in unauthorized missions deep in Taliban-controlled territory, operations that weren't reflected in official logs or supported by proper intelligence briefing. He described inadequate equipment, insufficient backup support, and a command structure that seemed more concerned with plausible deniability than soldier safety. His final entries expressed growing concern about orders that violated established protocols and endangered lives for unclear strategic objectives. The journal mentioned other soldiers by name, personnel who had also died during the same time period under similar circumstances. Elena cross-referenced these names with casualty reports and found a pattern that made her blood run cold. 12 soldiers from the 82nd Airborne had been killed during a 6-week period, all during what were classified as routine operations in secure areas. Yet, Torres's journal suggested these men had actually died during dangerous missions that command had refused to officially acknowledge. Elena spent her evenings researching the deceased soldiers online, reading obituaries and social media posts from grieving families. She found references to letters and phone calls home describing dangerous missions that didn't match official explanations. Parents quoted their children's concerns about being sent into harm's way without proper support or clear objectives. Girlfriends and wives shared screenshots of text messages expressing fear about operations they weren't supposed to discuss. The evidence painted a picture of systematic deception. Soldiers were being ordered to conduct high-risk missions while commanders maintained official deniability by classifying them as routine activities. When those missions resulted in casualties, the deaths were attributed to standard patrol activities rather than the unauthorized operations that had actually caused them. Elena realized she was looking at evidence of a cover-up that reached far beyond simple administrative incompetence. Someone in the command structure had been ordering soldiers into danger while ensuring that official records would protect the decision-makers from accountability. The 12 dead soldiers were victims not just of enemy action, but of a leadership failure that had been deliberately concealed. Her investigation led her deeper into the warehouse's archives, where she discovered communication logs that had been improperly stored among routine supply records. The logs revealed radio traffic between field units and higher command during the period when the 12 soldiers had died. Elena's experience with military communications allowed her to decode the tactical significance of seemingly routine messages. What she found was evidence of missions being planned and executed outside normal command channels. Orders were being transmitted through informal networks that bypassed official documentation requirements. Resources were being allocated for operations that didn't exist on any official schedule. Most damning of all, requests for additional support and evacuation assistance had been denied or delayed, contributing directly to the casualties that followed. Elena began documenting everything she found, photographing pages with her personal cell phone and storing the images in encrypted folders. She knew that accessing classified information without authorization was a serious violation of military regulations, but the evidence she was uncovering suggested crimes far more serious than improper file handling. The scope of the cover-up became clear when Elena discovered correspondence between Major Blackstone and officers at higher command levels. The communications revealed Blackstone's direct involvement in planning and authorizing the unauthorized missions. As a company commander, he lacked the authority to order such operations independently, which meant he was either exceeding his command authority or acting on orders from superiors who were avoiding official documentation. Blackstone's messages showed a pattern of risk-taking and corner-cutting that prioritized career advancement over soldier safety. He had volunteered his unit for dangerous assignments in hopes of earning combat decorations and efficiency reports that would accelerate his promotion timeline. The unauthorized missions were his attempt to gain the kind of combat leadership experience that his career had previously lacked. Elena realized why Blackstone had been so hostile toward her from the beginning. Her combat experience and tactical knowledge posed a direct threat to his deception. If she had been allowed to participate in planning or reviewing the missions that killed 12 soldiers, she would have immediately recognized the operational flaws and safety violations. Her presence in the unit represented a constant risk that someone with actual expertise might expose his incompetence and criminal negligence. The transfer to warehouse duty wasn't just about removing a perceived liability. It was about eliminating a witness who possessed the knowledge and experience necessary to understand what had really happened to those 12 soldiers. Blackstone had hidden his cover-up behind accusations of her instability, using her combat stress as justification for isolating her from information that could expose his crimes. Elena found herself in possession of evidence that could destroy multiple military careers and potentially result in criminal prosecution for those responsible. But she also knew that coming forward would require her to admit to unauthorized access of classified materials, potentially subjecting herself to court-martial and imprisonment. The system was designed to protect itself, making it nearly impossible for someone at her level to challenge misconduct by superior officers. As she continued her investigation, Elena discovered that the cover-up extended beyond just the 12 casualties. Equipment losses, budget overruns, and intelligence failures had all been systematically concealed through falsified reports and misdirected documentation. The unauthorized missions had been part of a broader pattern of reckless leadership that treated soldiers' lives as acceptable losses in pursuit of personal advancement. Elena realized she was facing the same choice that had confronted her during combat operations. She could follow safe procedures and protect herself, or she could take risks to protect her fellow soldiers. The difference was that this time, the enemy wasn't foreign. Insurgents. It was the corrupt leadership structure that had betrayed the trust of the soldiers under its command. The crisis began on a Tuesday morning when Captain Sarah Mitchell burst into the warehouse, her face pale and her hands shaking as she clutched a secure communication device. Elena looked up from the inventory sheets she had been using to catalog suspicious equipment serial numbers, immediately recognizing the signs of someone carrying devastating news. "Vasquez, thank God you're here," Captain Mitchell gasped, struggling to catch her breath. "We've got a situation developing in real time. Echo Company is pinned down in Afghanistan, and we're losing communication with multiple units in the field." Elena set down her clipboard, her combat instincts automatically shifting into high alert. Captain Mitchell was the base communications officer, responsible for coordinating information flow between Fort Blackwood and deployed units overseas. The two women had developed a mutual respect during Elena's brief stint in the communications section before her reassignment to warehouse duty. "What's the current situation?" Elena asked, her voice immediately taking on the calm, professional tone she had perfected during convoy operations under fire. Mitchell activated her tablet, displaying a tactical map that showed unit positions across Helmand Province. Red icons indicated units under fire, while flashing yellow markers represented communications blackouts. The picture was chaos. Scattered friendly forces with degraded command and control, exactly the kind of scenario that led to friendly fire incidents and unnecessary casualties. Echo Company was conducting what was supposed to be a routine patrol sweep near Forward Operating Base Apache, Mitchell explained, her finger tracing the movement on the map. Intelligence indicated the area had been cleared of enemy forces 3 weeks ago, but they walked into what appears to be a coordinated ambush involving at least 50 Taliban fighters with heavy weapons. Elena studied the tactical display, her experienced eye immediately identifying several problems with the mission planning. The patrol route took Echo Company through a valley with limited escape routes, and the timing coincided with a period when supporting air assets were committed to operations in adjacent provinces. It was exactly the kind of tactical mistake that got soldiers killed. "Who authorized this mission?" Elena asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Major Blackstone personally briefed the patrol leaders yesterday evening," Mitchell replied. He assured them that intelligence was solid and that the area posed minimal threat. But Elena, there's something else. The patrol was supposed to be a simple presence operation, but intercepted radio traffic suggests they were actually conducting some kind of search and recovery mission. Elena felt the familiar cold sensation in her stomach that always preceded bad news in combat zones. Search and recovery missions required specialized equipment, detailed intelligence briefing, and carefully coordinated support elements. If Echo Company had been sent out unprepared for their actual mission, they were facing far worse than just an unexpected firefight. What kind of search and recovery? Elena pressed, though part of her already knew. Mitchell lowered her voice, glancing around the empty warehouse to ensure they weren't being overheard. "There are reports of missing equipment from previous operations, including sensitive communications gear and weapons systems. Blackstone has been under pressure from higher command to account for discrepancies in inventory reports." Elena's investigation over the past weeks suddenly took on new urgency. The equipment she had been tracking, the suspicious serial numbers and date discrepancies, were apparently part of a larger pattern of missing military assets. Blackstone hadn't just covered up the deaths of 12 soldiers. He had also been concealing equipment losses that had likely fallen into enemy hands. "Captain, I need to ask you something, and I need you to trust me," Elena said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "During your communications duties, have you noticed any patterns in mission authorizations? Anything that seemed unusual about command protocols for deployed units?" Mitchell hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Elena, what are you getting at? We've got soldiers in immediate danger, and you're asking about administrative procedures. Because those administrative procedures might be exactly why our soldiers are in danger, Elena replied firmly. How many unauthorized missions has Blackstone been coordinating through unofficial channels? The question hit its mark. Mitchell's expression shifted from confusion to horrified understanding as she realized what Elena was suggesting. You think Echo Company was set up? Before Elena could respond, Mitchell's communication device erupted with urgent transmissions from the field. The voices coming through the speakers carried the unmistakable stress of soldiers under heavy fire, their words punctuated by the distinctive crack of incoming rifle rounds and the deeper explosions of mortar attacks. Foxtrot Base, this is Echo 6, came the desperate voice of the patrol leader. We are taking effective fire from multiple directions. Request immediate close air support and medical evacuation for casualties. Our position is compromised, and we have limited ammunition. The response from Base Command was delayed and confused. Echo 6, stand by for air support coordination. Be advised that all available assets are currently committed to operations in adjacent sectors. Elena grabbed Mitchell's device, her frustration overriding military protocol. What adjacent operations? She demanded. There shouldn't be any major operations running concurrently in that province. Mitchell pulled up her operational schedule, scanning through deployment logs and mission assignments. Her face grew increasingly pale as she realized what Elena already suspected. There are no other operations, she whispered. Every air asset in the region should be available for immediate support. The radio crackled again with increasingly desperate transmissions. Echo Company was reporting multiple wounded soldiers, dwindling ammunition supplies, and enemy forces attempting to overrun their position. Their requests for support were being met with bureaucratic delays and contradictory instructions that suggested coordination failures at the highest levels. Elena's combat experience allowed her to read between the lines of the tactical communications. Echo Company wasn't just facing an enemy ambush. They were being systematically abandoned by their own command structure. The support resources that should have been immediately available were being withheld or misdirected, turning what should have been a manageable engagement into a potential catastrophe. Captain, we need to get to Major Blackstone immediately, Elena said, already moving toward the warehouse exit. If what I suspect is true, Echo Company isn't just in tactical trouble. They're being deliberately sacrificed to cover up something much larger. Mitchell grabbed her equipment and followed Elena across the base toward the command center. As they walked, she continued monitoring the radio traffic from Echo Company, her expression growing more horrified with each transmission. The soldiers in the field were reporting not just enemy contact but evidence that their position had been compromised before they ever reached the target area. Elena, they're saying the Taliban fighters were waiting for them, Mitchell said, her voice shaking. The enemy knew exactly when and where they would be. This wasn't a chance encounter. It was a planned ambush based on advanced intelligence. Elena felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. The unauthorized missions, the missing equipment, the systematic cover-up of previous casualties. It all pointed to a compromise in operational security that went far beyond simple negligence. Someone had been providing information to enemy forces, either deliberately or through criminal carelessness with classified intelligence. The command center was buzzing with activity when they arrived, but Elena immediately noticed what was missing. Major Blackstone, who should have been coordinating the response to his unit's emergency, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, junior officers were struggling to manage a crisis they didn't understand, working with incomplete information and conflicting orders. Where's Major Blackstone? Elena demanded of the duty officer, a young lieutenant who looked overwhelmed by the scope of the developing situation. He's in a classified briefing with the colonel, the lieutenant replied. All communication with Echo Company is being routed through higher command channels. Elena felt her anger building as she realized what was happening. While his soldiers faced death in Afghanistan, Blackstone was likely crafting another cover story, preparing explanations that would shift blame away from his own leadership failures. The same pattern that had resulted in 12 previous deaths was playing out again, with Echo Company serving as the latest casualties in his campaign of deception. The radio traffic from Echo Company was becoming increasingly desperate. Their ammunition was nearly exhausted. Several soldiers were critically wounded, and enemy forces were preparing for a final assault on their position. Yet the command response remained hesitant and confused, with support assets being redirected through bureaucratic channels that ensured critical delays. Elena realized she was witnessing the same systematic abandonment that had killed Torres and the other 11 soldiers. Command was allowing tactical situations to deteriorate until casualties became inevitable, then using those casualties to justify policy changes and personnel actions that protected the leadership responsible for creating the crisis in the first place. But this time was different. This time, Elena was present with access to real-time information and the tactical knowledge to understand what was really happening. She faced a choice that would define not just her military career, but her fundamental identity as a soldier sworn to protect her brothers and sisters in arms. Elena didn't wait for permission. She moved to the primary communications console, her fingers dancing across controls she had operated countless times during her deployment. The duty officer started to protest, but Captain Mitchell placed a restraining hand on his arm, recognizing that Elena possessed expertise that far exceeded anyone else currently in the command center. Echo 6, this is Warehouse Angel, Elena transmitted, using an improvised call sign that wouldn't immediately identify her to monitoring personnel. I have your position marked, and I'm tracking your tactical situation. Can you provide a detailed assessment of enemy positions and your current capabilities? The response came immediately, tinged with desperate relief. Warehouse Angel, this is Echo 6. We have approximately 45 enemy fighters in fortified positions on 3 sides of our location. We've got 4 wounded, including 2 critical. Ammunition down to less than 2 magazines per man. We need immediate extraction or reinforcement. Elena studied the tactical display, her mind automatically calculating distances, terrain features, and available resources. Her combat experience allowed her to visualize the battlefield in ways that the junior officers around her couldn't match. She could see solutions that their textbook training hadn't prepared them to recognize. Echo 6, be advised I'm showing available Quick Reaction Force assets at Forward Operating Base Thunder, approximately 12 minutes flight time from your position, Elena transmitted. Also showing Apache attack helicopters at FOB Lightning that could provide immediate close air support. Negative, Warehouse Angel, came the frustrated reply. We've been told all assets are committed to higher priority missions. Command is advising us to establish defensive positions and wait for support that may not arrive for several hours. Elena felt her jaw clench as she realized the full scope of the deception. The resources needed to save Echo Company were available and ready, but they were being deliberately withheld. Someone in the command structure was allowing soldiers to die rather than acknowledge the unauthorized nature of their mission. She turned to Captain Mitchell, who had been monitoring the conversation with growing alarm. Captain, I need you to pull up the current operational status for all air assets in Helmand Province. Real-time data, not the sanitized reports that are being fed to the Tactical Operations Center. Mitchell hesitated for only a moment before accessing her classified databases. What appeared on her screen confirmed Elena's worst fears. 2 Apache helicopters sat on standby at FOB Lightning, with full ammunition loads and fuel. A Quick Reaction Force team was conducting routine training exercises less than 20 kilometers from Echo Company's position. Multiple air support assets were listed as available for immediate tasking. Elena, this is insane, Mitchell whispered. These resources could save those soldiers, but someone is blocking their deployment. Elena keyed her microphone again, her voice taking on the command authority she had developed during convoy leadership in combat zones. Thunder Base, this is Staff Sergeant Vasquez with emergency authorization request. I need immediate deployment of QRF assets to assist troops in contact. Authentication follows. She rattled off a series of codes that she had memorized during her previous deployment, emergency authorizations that could bypass normal command channels during life-threatening situations. The response from Thunder Base was immediate and professional. Copy, Staff Sergeant Vasquez. QRF is spinning up for immediate deployment. ETA to contact zone is 14 minutes. Be advised we will need confirmation from higher command for official authorization. Thunder Base, this is Elena Vasquez, Authentication Tango 7, Charlie 9. I am authorizing immediate deployment under Emergency Combat Authority. Lives are in immediate danger and normal command channels are compromised. Execute immediately. Elena knew she was exceeding her authority in the most serious way possible. Staff sergeants didn't have the power to authorize Quick Reaction Force deployments or redirect air assets. But her combat experience had taught her that sometimes saving lives required breaking rules, and she was prepared to face any consequences if it meant preventing another preventable tragedy. The command center erupted in confusion as other personnel realized what Elena was doing. The duty officer was frantically trying to reach Major Blackstone, while junior enlisted soldiers looked uncertain about whether they should intervene. Captain Mitchell stood firmly beside Elena, her presence providing tacit approval for the unauthorized actions. Lightning Base, this is Staff Sergeant Vasquez requesting immediate close air support for troops in contact, Elena continued, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. I have friendly positions marked and enemy concentrations identified. Request immediate engagement of hostile forces threatening American personnel. Copy, Staff Sergeant. Lightning Flight is airborne and proceeding to contact zone, ETA 6 minutes. We'll need target designation and confirmation of friendly positions. Elena began coordinating the most complex military operation of her career, directing air assets and ground forces from a warehouse worker's position in a command center thousands of miles from the battlefield. Her hands moved across multiple communication devices simultaneously, maintaining contact with Echo Company while coordinating with supporting units throughout the operational area. Echo 6, be advised you have inbound support, she transmitted. QRF is 14 minutes out, close air support in 6 minutes. I need you to mark your positions with IR strobes and prepare to designate enemy targets. Warehouse Angel, you beautiful person, whoever you are, came the relieved response from Echo 6. We can hear rotors approaching from the south. How did you make this happen? Elena didn't answer the question directly, focusing instead on the tactical coordination that would determine whether Echo Company survived the next 20 minutes. She directed the Apache helicopters to specific enemy positions, coordinated ammunition resupply drops, and established medical evacuation procedures for the wounded soldiers. The young duty officer finally reached Major Blackstone by secure telephone, and Elena could hear angry voices demanding to know who had authorized the military response. But the operation was already underway, with American aircraft engaging enemy forces and ground units moving to reinforce the surrounded patrol. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, report to my office immediately, Major Blackstone's voice boomed through the command center intercom. All personnel are directed to cease unauthorized communications immediately. Elena ignored the order, continuing to coordinate the rescue operation as reports began flowing in from the battlefield. The Apache helicopters had engaged enemy positions with devastating effect, breaking up the coordinated attack on Echo Company's position. The Quick Reaction Force was approaching the landing zone, preparing to establish a security perimeter for medical evacuation. Echo 6, this is Warehouse Angel. Your support package has arrived. Medical evacuation is inbound for your wounded. Hold your positions and prepare for friendly forces approaching from the west. Captain Mitchell grabbed Elena's shoulder, her expression a mixture of admiration and terror. Elena, they're going to court-martial you for this. You've just commandeered military assets without authorization and directly disobeyed orders from your commanding officer. Elena continued monitoring the radio traffic as Echo Company reported successful link-up with their reinforcements. The wounded soldiers were being evacuated to medical facilities, and the surviving patrol members were being extracted to safety. Her unauthorized intervention had saved lives that would otherwise have been lost to bureaucratic delays and command failures. Captain, I'd rather face court-martial than explain to 12 families why I didn't try to prevent another preventable tragedy, Elena replied, finally stepping back from the communications console. Those soldiers are alive because someone was willing to break the rules that were designed to protect careers instead of lives. Major Blackstone burst into the command center with 2 military police officers, his face red with rage and his uniform disheveled from his rushed response to the crisis. He looked around the room, taking in the tactical displays showing successful rescue operations and the communications logs documenting Elena's unauthorized coordination. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, you are under arrest for violation of direct orders, unauthorized use of military communications equipment, and exceeding command authority, Blackstone announced, his voice shaking with fury. Your reckless actions have compromised operational security and violated multiple provisions of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Elena came to attention, her expression calm despite the magnitude of the accusations being leveled against her. Around the command center, other personnel watched in stunned silence as their warehouse worker faced down their commanding officer over actions that had undoubtedly saved American lives. "Sir, I accept full responsibility for my actions," Elena stated formally. "I believe that immediate intervention was necessary to prevent casualties among American forces under my ultimate command responsibility as a non-commissioned officer." The military police moved to place Elena in custody, but Captain Mitchell stepped forward with her communication device still displaying the tactical results of the rescue operation. "Major, before you proceed with this arrest, I think you need to see something that Staff Sergeant Vasquez discovered during her investigation." Major Blackstone's face turned an even deeper shade of red as Captain Mitchell's words hung in the air. The military police officers hesitated, uncertain whether to proceed with the arrest or wait for clarification. Elena remained at attention, but her eyes were fixed on Blackstone's expression, watching for the telltale signs of panic that she had learned to recognize in soldiers facing exposure of their failures. "Captain Mitchell, you are out of line," Blackstone snapped, his voice carrying the sharp edge of desperation disguised as authority. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez has committed serious violations of military law, and no amount of subordinate speculation will change that fact." Mitchell activated her tablet, displaying the tactical summary of Elena's successful rescue coordination. The screen showed real-time updates from Echo Company, confirming that all wounded soldiers had been successfully evacuated and that the patrol was secure. "Sir, respectfully, I think the results speak for themselves. Staff Sergeant Vasquez just prevented what could have been a massacre." "The results are irrelevant," Blackstone declared, though his eyes kept darting to the tactical display showing the successful mission. "Military discipline cannot be subject to individual interpretation, regardless of outcome. Orders exist for reasons that enlisted personnel cannot be expected to understand." Elena felt the familiar surge of combat adrenaline as she recognized the moment when diplomatic solutions gave way to direct confrontation. "Sir, may I ask why you denied air support and quick reaction force assets to soldiers under immediate enemy fire?" The question cut through the bureaucratic rhetoric like a blade. Blackstone's jaw worked silently for several seconds as he struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't incriminate him further. The command center had grown completely quiet, with every person present understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple, disciplinary action. "That information is classified above your clearance level," Blackstone finally managed, but his voice lacked the conviction of his earlier pronouncements. Elena took a step forward, her posture still respectfully military but her tone carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to demand answers. "Sir, those same assets were listed as available on the operational status reports. There were no higher priority missions requiring their commitment. Why were American soldiers told to wait for support that you refused to authorize?" Captain Mitchell consulted her communication logs, scrolling through the official message traffic that had preceded Elena's intervention. "Major, the operational logs show that you personally countermanded the initial air support request from Echo 6. You directed them to maintain defensive positions without explaining why immediate support was unavailable." Blackstone looked around the command center, realizing that his carefully constructed narrative was unraveling in front of witnesses who possessed the technical knowledge to understand the implications of his decisions. The junior officers and enlisted personnel were watching him with expressions that ranged from confusion to dawning suspicion. "The tactical situation required careful assessment before committing resources," he said, but the explanations sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Rash decisions based on incomplete information can lead to greater casualties and mission failure." Elena had heard enough evasive language during her investigation to recognize deliberate obfuscation. "Sir, what additional information did you require?" Echo Company reported their position, enemy strength, casualties, and ammunition status. What assessment could possibly justify delaying life-saving support? The answer came not from Blackstone, but from Colonel Patricia Hayes, who entered the command center with the measured stride of someone accustomed to command authority. Her Silver Eagle insignia caught the overhead lighting as she surveyed the tense scene, taking in the tactical displays, the arrested development of Elena's detention, and the obvious strain in Major Blackstone's demeanor. "Major Blackstone, report," Colonel Hayes commanded, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made shouting unnecessary. Blackstone straightened, attempting to regain his composure in front of his superior officer. Ma'am, Staff Sergeant Vasquez exceeded her authority by coordinating unauthorized military operations and disobeying direct orders. I've ordered her arrest for violation of multiple articles of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Colonel Hayes examined the tactical displays showing the successful rescue of Echo Company, then turned her attention to the communication logs documenting Elena's coordination efforts. Her expression remained neutral, but Elena noticed the subtle signs of someone processing complex information and reaching uncomfortable conclusions. Major, explain to me why Echo Company was conducting operations in an area that intelligence reports indicated was cleared of enemy presence 3 weeks ago, Hayes said, her tone carrying the precision of a surgical instrument. The question struck at the heart of the operational failure, and Elena watched Blackstone struggle to formulate an answer that wouldn't expose his unauthorized mission planning. Ma'am, intelligence assessments are constantly evolving. Enemy forces are mobile and opportunistic. That's not what I asked, Hayes replied sharply. I asked why your soldiers were in that specific location, conducting what type of operation, under whose authorization. Elena realized that Colonel Hayes already suspected something was wrong with the official explanation. Her questions were designed to force Blackstone into either admitting the truth or constructing lies that could be later disproven through official investigation. Captain Mitchell stepped forward with her tablet, displaying the communication intercepts that had revealed the true nature of Echo Company's mission. Ma'am, intercepts suggest Echo Company was conducting equipment recovery operations, not the routine patrol described in official reports. Colonel Hayes studied the intercepts, her expression growing increasingly stern as she absorbed the implications. Equipment recovery missions required specific authorization from higher command levels, detailed intelligence briefing, and coordination with multiple support agencies. If Echo Company had been conducting such operations without proper authorization, it represented a serious breach of military protocol. Major Blackstone, did you authorize equipment recovery operations without coordination through proper channels? Hayes asked, her voice taking on the formal tone that preceded serious disciplinary action. Elena watched Blackstone's face cycle through a series of expressions as he realized the scope of his exposure. Denial would require him to explain why intercepted communications contradicted his version of events. Admission would confirm that he had been conducting unauthorized operations that had resulted in American casualties. Ma'am, operational security requires certain missions to be conducted through compartmentalized channels, Blackstone offered, attempting to invoke classification procedures as justification for his actions. Major, I am your immediate superior officer with full security clearance for all operations conducted by units under my command, Hayes replied icily. If you conducted operations without my knowledge and authorization, you have exceeded your command authority in the most serious possible way. Elena felt the moment of truth approaching as the conversation reached the point where euphemisms and bureaucratic language would give way to direct accusations and formal charges. She had initiated this confrontation by saving Echo Company, but Colonel Hayes was clearly prepared to pursue it far beyond Elena's original intervention. Furthermore, Hayes continued, I have received reports suggesting that similar unauthorized operations may have been conducted previously, resulting in casualties that were subsequently misrepresented in official records. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, I understand you have been conducting research into equipment discrepancies and deployment records. Elena felt her heart racing as she realized that her investigation had attracted attention from higher command levels. Colonel Hayes wasn't just responding to the immediate crisis with Echo Company. She was prepared to examine the broader pattern of misconduct that Elena had uncovered. Ma'am, during my warehouse duties I discovered evidence suggesting that previous casualties may have resulted from unauthorized operations that were not accurately reported through official channels. Elena replied carefully, knowing that her words would determine whether she faced court-martial or became a protected witness in a criminal investigation. Major Blackstone's face had gone pale as he realized that his carefully constructed cover-up was collapsing around him. The deaths of Torres and the other 11 soldiers, the missing equipment, the systematic falsification of records, everything was about to be exposed through an investigation that he could no longer control. Colonel Hayes nodded grimly, her expression indicating that Elena's response confirmed suspicions that had been developing through other channels. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, you will be temporarily reassigned to my personal staff pending completion of a formal investigation into these matters. Major Blackstone, you are relieved of command effective immediately. The silence that followed Colonel Hayes' announcement stretched across the command center like a physical force. Major Blackstone stood frozen, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, rage, and desperate calculation. Elena could see his mind working frantically, searching for some way to salvage his position or shift blame away from his own actions. "Ma'am, I must protest this decision," Blackstone finally managed, his voice strained, but attempting to maintain professional composure. "My command decisions have been based on legitimate operational concerns and proper military judgment. Staff Sergeant Vasquez has demonstrated a pattern of insubordination and mental instability that makes her allegations unreliable." Colonel Hayes turned to face Blackstone directly, her expression carrying the kind of cold authority that Elena had only seen in the most senior combat leaders. "Major, your protest is noted and will be documented in the official record. However, the immediate evidence suggests serious failures in command judgment that require immediate action to prevent additional casualties. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel." Elena felt the weight of the moment as she realized that her investigation had triggered events far beyond her original intentions. What had begun as her personal quest to understand suspicious equipment records had evolved into a formal command investigation that could destroy multiple military careers and potentially result in criminal prosecution. "Sir, if I may?" Elena interjected, addressing Colonel Hayes with the careful formality that serious situations required. "The evidence I've uncovered extends beyond just the recent operations. There appears to be a systematic pattern of unauthorized missions, falsified reports, and concealed casualties spanning several months." Blackstone spun toward Elena, his carefully maintained facade finally cracking under the pressure of exposure. "Colonel, this soldier has been accessing classified materials without authorization, conducting unauthorized investigations, and making wild accusations based on incomplete information. Her combat stress issues have clearly affected her judgment and reliability." "Major, you will not address Staff Sergeant Vasquez directly," Hayes commanded sharply. "Your concerns about her methods and mental state are noted, but they do not address the substantive questions about operational authorization and casualty reporting." Elena appreciated Colonel Hayes' protection, but she knew that the real test lay ahead. Blackstone's accusations about her accessing classified materials were technically accurate, and military law placed strict limits on unauthorized intelligence gathering, regardless of the motivation or results. Captain Mitchell stepped forward with her tablet, displaying the communication logs that had documented the Echo Company crisis in real time. "Ma'am, I can confirm that Staff Sergeant Vasquez's intervention today saved American lives. Her tactical coordination was flawless, and her assessment of available resources was completely accurate." "Captain Mitchell, your observations are valuable and will be included in the official investigation," Hayes replied. However, the immediate question is not Staff Sergeant Vasquez's competence, but the command decisions that made her intervention necessary. Elena realized that Colonel Hayes was carefully separating the immediate tactical success from the larger questions about unauthorized operations and concealed casualties. The rescue of Echo Company would protect Elena from the most serious charges related to exceeding her authority, but the investigation into Blackstone's misconduct would require evidence that might implicate her in unauthorized intelligence gathering. "Ma'am, I request permission to present the evidence I've compiled regarding the previous casualties and equipment discrepancies," Elena said, knowing that this moment would determine whether she became a protected witness or a co-defendant in the investigation. Colonel Hayes studied Elena's expression for several seconds, clearly evaluating both her credibility and the potential legal implications of her unauthorized research. "Staff Sergeant, before you proceed, I must advise you that anything you reveal about classified materials or intelligence sources may subject you to prosecution under military law. Do you understand the risks?" Elena had faced this same choice multiple times during combat operations, moments when personal safety had to be weighed against the lives of fellow soldiers. The answer had always been the same. The mission and the lives of her brothers and sisters in arms took precedence over her own protection. "Ma'am, I understand the risks, and I accept full responsibility for my actions. 12 soldiers died because of decisions that were never properly investigated or reported. I cannot allow that pattern to continue." Blackstone made one final desperate attempt to control the narrative. "Colonel, this entire situation has been manufactured by a disturbed soldier who cannot accept legitimate command decisions. Staff Sergeant Vasquez has been unable to adapt to peacetime operations following her combat deployments, and she has constructed elaborate conspiracy theories to explain normal military operations. Elena felt the familiar surge of anger at having her combat experience weaponized against her, but she forced herself to remain calm and professional. Colonel Hayes was clearly intelligent enough to recognize manipulation when she heard it, and emotional responses would only undermine Elena's credibility. Major Blackstone, your characterization of Staff Sergeant Vasquez's mental state is inappropriate and irrelevant to the operational questions at hand, Hayes said firmly. The evidence will be evaluated based on its factual content, not on personal attacks against the person who compiled it. Elena retrieved her personal cell phone, accessing the encrypted folders where she had stored photographs of the documents she had discovered during her warehouse investigation. Ma'am, I have documented evidence of communication logs, equipment serial numbers, casualty reports, and deployment records that contradict official explanations for the deaths of 12 soldiers from the 82nd Airborne Division. She handed the phone to Colonel Hayes, who began scrolling through the images with obvious professional interest. Elena could see the colonel's expression changing as she absorbed the implications of the documented evidence. Falsified dates, missing equipment, unauthorized communications, and systematic patterns of deception. Staff Sergeant, this represents months of detailed investigation, Hayes observed. How did you gain access to these classified materials? Elena knew that her answer would determine her future in the military, but she had committed herself to complete honesty regardless of the consequences. Ma'am, during my warehouse duties, I discovered improperly filed documents among general equipment returns. My initial investigation began with routine inventory discrepancies, but the evidence led me to examine broader patterns of record-keeping failures. The explanation was technically accurate while minimizing the extent of her unauthorized intelligence gathering. Lena had indeed discovered the initial evidence through legitimate warehouse duties, but her subsequent investigation had clearly exceeded the bounds of her assigned responsibilities. Colonel Hayes continued examining the documented evidence, her expression growing increasingly grim as the scope of the misconduct became apparent. Major Blackstone, these documents appear to show systematic falsification of casualty reports and deployment records. How do you explain these discrepancies? Blackstone's face had gone completely pale as he realized that Elena's evidence was far more comprehensive than he had anticipated. His carefully constructed cover-up had depended on the assumption that no single person possessed enough information to recognize the patterns of deception. Ma'am, I would need to examine the specific documents in question before providing detailed responses, he said, but his voice lacked any remaining conviction. You will have that opportunity during the formal investigation, Hayes replied coldly. Military Police. Place Major Blackstone under arrest pending investigation for dereliction of duty, falsification of official records, and violations of operational security protocols. Elena watched as the military police officers who had originally come to arrest her instead placed handcuffs on Major Blackstone. The irony was not lost on her. The man who had called her a liability was being removed from command for actions that had actually endangered soldier safety. But Elena knew that Blackstone's arrest was only the beginning of a process that would likely consume months and potentially implicate officers at much higher command levels. The evidence she had uncovered suggested that the cover-up extended far beyond a single company commander, involving systematic failures in oversight and accountability that reached into the highest levels of military leadership. Colonel Hayes turned to address the personnel who had witnessed the dramatic confrontation. This investigation will be conducted with complete transparency and adherence to military law. Anyone with relevant information is directed to cooperate fully with investigating officers. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, you will remain available for additional questioning and testimony. Elena felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as she realized that her role was shifting from suspected criminal to key witness in a major military investigation. The evidence she had compiled would now be examined by professional investigators, with the authority to pursue criminal charges against anyone involved in the cover-up. The decision that had begun with her unauthorized rescue of Echo Company had evolved into something far larger, a confrontation with systemic corruption that threatened the fundamental trust between military leadership and the soldiers they commanded. The investigation that followed moved with the methodical precision of military justice at its most serious level. Within 48 hours, a team of Criminal Investigation Division agents had established a secure facility at Fort Blackwood, transforming an unused administrative building into a hub of forensic examination and witness interviews. Elena found herself at the center of proceedings that would ultimately determine the fate of multiple officers and potentially reshape military accountability procedures. Special Agent Rebecca Torres, a seasoned CID investigator with 15 years of experience in military criminal cases, conducted Elena's initial formal interview. The agent's no-nonsense demeanor and thorough preparation immediately established that this was far beyond a routine disciplinary matter. The conference room smelled of fresh coffee and legal documents, its walls now covered with evidence boards displaying timelines, photographs, and connection charts that mapped the scope of the suspected conspiracy. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, "I want to be clear about your status in this investigation," Agent Torres began, settling into her chair across the metal table. "You are currently classified as a key witness rather than a subject of criminal investigation. However, that status could change depending on what we discover about your methods of evidence gathering." Elena had expected this conversation and had prepared herself to accept whatever consequences resulted from her actions. "Ma'am, I understand the legal implications of my unauthorized research. I'm prepared to face appropriate discipline for any violations of military law." Torres consulted her notes, which Elena could see contained detailed summaries of every document she had photographed during her warehouse investigation. The thoroughness of the CID preparation was both impressive and intimidating, suggesting that the military was taking these allegations with the utmost seriousness. "Let's start with Sergeant Michael Torres," the agent continued. "According to your statement, you discovered his personal journal among returned equipment from Afghanistan. Walk me through exactly how that discovery occurred." Elena described the misfiling of Torres's personal effects, explaining how administrative errors had resulted in classified materials being stored with general inventory returns. She detailed her decision to read the journal despite knowing she was violating the privacy of deceased personnel, and her growing horror as the entries revealed unauthorized missions that contradicted official casualty reports. The journal entries indicated that Sergeant Torres and his squad were ordered to conduct reconnaissance operations in areas that had supposedly been cleared of enemy presence, Elena explained. But his descriptions of enemy contact and tactical situations suggested these operations were far more dangerous than official reports indicated. Agent Torres produced a sealed evidence bag containing the original journal, now properly cataloged and marked for forensic examination. "We've had handwriting experts confirm the authenticity of these entries. The content matches intercepted communications and contradicts multiple official reports filed by Major Blackstone." Elena felt a mixture of vindication and sadness as she realized that Torres's words were finally being taken seriously by investigators with the authority to seek justice for his death. The soldiers' concerns about unauthorized operations and inadequate support had been dismissed during his lifetime, but they were now serving as crucial evidence in a criminal investigation. "Staff Sergeant, your investigation identified 11 other soldiers who died during the same time frame as Sergeant Torres," the agent continued. "Tell me about the patterns you discovered in their casualty reports." Elena described her systematic examination of deployment records, equipment, serial numbers, and communication logs. She explained how seemingly routine administrative data had revealed discrepancies that suggested coordinated deception rather than simple clerical errors. The deaths of 12 soldiers had been attributed to routine patrol activities, but the evidence indicated they had actually died during high-risk missions that commanders refused to officially acknowledge. Each casualty report followed the same pattern, Elena explained. Official explanations cited routine operations in secure areas, but equipment logs and communication intercepts suggested the soldiers were actually conducting unauthorized missions in hostile territory. Agent Torres displayed photographs of the 12 deceased soldiers on her laptop screen, their young faces serving as a stark reminder of the human cost of the corruption under investigation. "We've interviewed family members who received letters and phone calls describing dangerous operations that don't match official records. Parents quoted their children's concerns about inadequate support and unclear mission objectives." Elena studied the faces of soldiers she had never met, but whose stories had driven her investigation for months. They represented more than just evidence of misconduct. They were fellow veterans whose sacrifice had been dishonored by commanders more concerned with career advancement than soldier welfare. "Ma'am, what became clear during my research was that these weren't isolated incidents," Elena continued. Major Blackstone was systematically ordering high-risk operations while maintaining official deniability through falsified documentation. The agent nodded, consulting additional notes that suggested the CID investigation had uncovered evidence far beyond what Elena had compiled independently. We've discovered communication logs between Major Blackstone and officers at higher command levels. The exchanges suggest he was under pressure to demonstrate combat leadership experience and was volunteering his unit for dangerous assignments to enhance his promotion prospects. Elena felt her anger building as she absorbed the full implications of what the investigators had discovered. Soldiers had died not to accomplish strategic objectives or protect American interests, but to satisfy one officer's career ambitions and desire for combat credentials he had never legitimately earned. "Staff Sergeant, I need to ask you about your decision to intervene during the Echo Company crisis," Agent Torres said, shifting to the events that had ultimately triggered the formal investigation. "You exceeded your authority in the most serious way possible. What motivated you to take such extreme risks?" Elena had anticipated this question and had struggled with how to explain decisions that had been driven more by instinct than careful calculation. "Ma'am, my combat experience taught me to recognize tactical situations where delays would result in casualties. Echo Company was facing the same systematic abandonment that had killed the previous 12 soldiers. But you understood that your intervention could result in court-martial and imprisonment," the agent pressed. "Why were you willing to accept such severe personal consequences?" The answer came from the deepest part of Elena's identity as a soldier and leader. "Ma'am, I took an oath to protect my fellow soldiers. When I realized that Echo Company was being deliberately denied support that could save their lives, I couldn't stand by and watch it happen again." Agent Torres made additional notes, her expression indicating that Elena's motivation would be crucial to determining how prosecutors approached any charges related to unauthorized command actions. Military law recognized necessity as a defense for exceeding authority, but only when the circumstances justified extreme measures. "The tactical coordination you provided saved every member of Echo Company," the agent observed. "Your decisions were militarily sound and arguably prevented a massacre. However, the legal system must still address the fact that you assumed command authority that far exceeded your rank and position." Elena understood the complex legal situation she faced. Her actions had been successful and morally justified, but they had also violated fundamental principles of military hierarchy and command structure. The investigation would ultimately need to balance her success in saving lives against the precedent set by allowing subordinates to override superior officers. "We've also discovered evidence that Major Blackstone may have deliberately delayed support to Echo Company in order to eliminate witnesses to his previous misconduct," Agent Torres continued. "If that proves accurate, your intervention prevented not just tactical casualties, but potential murder." Elena felt her blood chill as she realized the full scope of Blackstone's corruption. The systematic pattern of abandoned missions and concealed casualties hadn't been just about career advancement. It had evolved into active elimination of soldiers who might expose his crimes. "Ma'am, does that mean the 12 previous casualties were intentional rather than just negligent?" Elena asked. "That's what we're trying to determine," Agent Torres replied grimly. "What's clear is that Major Blackstone was willing to sacrifice soldier lives to protect his reputation and avoid accountability for his unauthorized operations." The investigation was revealing layers of misconduct far beyond what Elena had originally suspected. What had begun as her discovery of administrative discrepancies had exposed a conspiracy that potentially included premeditated murder of American soldiers by their own commanding officer. Agent Torres closed her notebook and leaned forward across the table. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez, your evidence and testimony will be crucial to achieving justice for those 12 soldiers and preventing similar tragedies in the future. Are you prepared to testify at court-martial proceedings and face cross-examination by defense attorneys?" Elena thought about Sergeant Torres and the 11 other soldiers whose deaths had been dishonored by systematic deception and cover-up. Their families deserved to know the truth about how their children had died, and future soldiers deserved protection from commanders who would sacrifice lives for personal advancement. "Ma'am, I'm prepared to do whatever is necessary to ensure justice for those soldiers and accountability for the officers responsible for their deaths." The courtroom at Fort Leavenworth buzzed with tension as Elena entered wearing her dress blue uniform, her ribbons and badges arranged with perfect precision across her chest. The bronze star and purple heart seemed to catch every ray of light that filtered through the high windows, serving as silent testimony to her combat credentials. 3 months of investigation had led to this moment: the court-martial of Major Richard Blackstone on charges that included dereliction of duty, falsification of official records, and conspiracy to commit murder. Elena took her seat in the witness section, acutely aware of the media representatives, family members of deceased soldiers, and senior military officials who filled every available space. The case had attracted national attention as details of the cover-up had leaked to civilian news outlets, creating a public relations nightmare for the Army and renewed scrutiny of military accountability procedures. Defense attorney Captain Mark Harrison stood to address the court, his perfectly pressed uniform and confident demeanor suggesting he had built his career on defending difficult cases. Elena recognized the calculated performance of someone who specialized in creating reasonable doubt through character assassination and procedural challenges. "Members of the court," Harrison began, his voice carrying the polished authority of expensive legal education, "the prosecution would have you believe that Major Blackstone deliberately sacrificed the lives of American soldiers to advance his career. This is a serious accusation that requires extraordinary evidence, not the paranoid delusions of a combat-traumatized soldier who has admitted to unauthorized intelligence gathering and exceeding her command authority." Elena felt her jaw clench as Harrison's opening statement painted her as an unreliable witness whose mental health issues had led to false accusations against a dedicated officer. The defense strategy was predictable but effective: undermine her credibility by emphasizing her combat stress and unauthorized actions while portraying Blackstone as a victim of vindictive accusations. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez has a documented history of insubordination and mental instability, Harrison continued, consulting his notes with theatrical precision. She was transferred from pilot training following complaints about her attitude and judgment. She was assigned to warehouse duty after demonstrating an inability to function effectively in her assigned position. Her unauthorized investigation violated multiple security protocols and military regulations. Elena had expected these attacks, but hearing her combat service and personal struggles weaponized against the truth still stung. She forced herself to maintain professional composure, knowing that any emotional reaction would only validate the defense's characterization of her as unstable. Military Judge Colonel William Roberts called for order as murmurs rippled through the courtroom. His stern expression and reputation for strict adherence to military law suggested that he would not tolerate theatrical grandstanding from either side. Defense counsel will confine opening statements to legal arguments rather than character assassination. Prosecutor Major Sarah Chen rose to present the government's case, her bearing reflecting the confidence of someone who had spent weeks reviewing mountains of evidence. Elena had worked closely with Chen during the investigation, providing detailed explanations of the documentary evidence and tactical assessments that formed the foundation of the prosecution's case. "Members of the court, the evidence will show that Major Blackstone systematically ordered unauthorized military operations while falsifying official records to conceal his actions," Chen announced. When those operations resulted in the deaths of 12 soldiers, he continued the cover-up through intimidation, document destruction, and attempts to eliminate witnesses who might expose his crimes. Elena watched the court members' faces as they absorbed the magnitude of the accusations. The panel consisted of senior officers with extensive combat experience, personnel who understood the gravity of command responsibility and the trust that soldiers placed in their leaders. If the evidence supported the prosecution's claims, Blackstone faced life imprisonment or even the death penalty. The government will present evidence showing that Major Blackstone deliberately denied air support and medical evacuation to Echo Company in an attempt to eliminate soldiers who possessed knowledge of his unauthorized operations, Chen continued. Only the unauthorized intervention of Staff Sergeant Vasquez prevented what would have been the premeditated murder of additional American personnel. Elena was called as the first witness, walking to the witness stand with the measured pace that had carried her through combat zones and formal military ceremonies. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, knowing that the next several hours would determine not just Blackstone's fate, but her own credibility and future in the military. Defense attorney Harrison wasted no time in attacking Elena's mental health and unauthorized actions. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez, you've been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder following your combat deployments, haven't you?" Elena had anticipated this line of questioning and had prepared herself to address her mental health struggles honestly while maintaining her dignity. Yes, sir. I've received treatment for combat-related stress, which is common among soldiers who have served in active combat zones. And this PTSD has affected your judgment and decision-making abilities, correct? Harrison pressed, attempting to establish a foundation for discrediting her testimony. Sir, I've received appropriate medical care and have been cleared for full duty by qualified medical professionals, Elena replied firmly. My combat experience has enhanced my ability to recognize tactical situations and assess military operations. Harrison produced Elena's personnel file, highlighting her transfer from pilot training and subsequent assignment to warehouse duty. Isn't it true that you were removed from pilot training due to complaints about your attitude and ability to follow orders? Elena felt the familiar anger at having her career sabotage weaponized against her credibility, but she maintained her professional composure. Sir, I was transferred following a harassment complaint I filed against my flight instructor. The instructor subsequently faced disciplinary action for inappropriate conduct with multiple female trainees. The revelation clearly surprised Harrison, who had apparently not researched the circumstances of Elena's pilot training dismissal. Prosecutor Chen had obviously prepared for this line of attack by ensuring that the court understood the real reasons behind Elena's career setbacks. Staff Sergeant, during your warehouse duties, you admittedly accessed classified materials without proper authorization, Harrison continued, attempting to regain momentum. You photographed sensitive documents and conducted unauthorized intelligence analysis. These are serious violations of military law. Elena had wrestled with this admission throughout the investigation, knowing that her methods had violated regulations even though her motivations had been pure. Sir, I discovered evidence of misconduct during routine inventory duties and felt obligated to investigate further when I realized soldiers had died due to command failures. But you understood that accessing classified materials without authorization could result in imprisonment, didn't you? Harrison pressed. Elena looked directly at the court members, knowing that her answer would define how they viewed her actions and motivations. Sir, I understood the legal risks, but I also understood that 12 soldiers had died because someone was covering up unauthorized operations. I believed my obligation to fellow soldiers outweighed the personal risks. Harrison's questioning continued for 2 hours, covering every aspect of Elena's unauthorized investigation and her intervention during the Echo Company crisis. He attempted to portray her as a rogue operator, whose combat trauma had led to paranoid conspiracy theories and dangerous violations of military discipline. But Elena's calm, professional responses and detailed knowledge of military operations gradually undermined his strategy. Her answers demonstrated tactical competence and rational analysis rather than the emotional instability he was trying to establish. When she described the specific evidence she had discovered and the patterns of deception she had identified, her testimony carried the authority of genuine expertise. Prosecutor Chen's redirect examination allowed Elena to explain the context behind her actions and the systematic nature of the cover-up she had exposed. She walked the court through the documentary evidence, explaining how equipment serial numbers, communication logs, and deployment records revealed a coordinated conspiracy to conceal unauthorized operations and resulting casualties. Staff Sergeant, in your professional opinion, based on your combat experience, what would have happened to Echo Company if you had not intervened to coordinate their rescue? Chen asked. Elena considered the question carefully, knowing that her assessment would be crucial to establishing the necessity defense for her unauthorized actions. Ma'am, based on the tactical situation and the systematic denial of available support resources, Echo Company would have been overrun with total casualties. Every soldier in that patrol would have died. The courtroom fell silent as Elena's words hung in the air, creating a moment of recognition that her violation of military hierarchy had prevented a massacre. The defense's attempts to portray her as unstable and insubordinate suddenly seemed petty compared to the magnitude of what her actions had accomplished. As Elena stepped down from the witness stand, she felt the weight of having told her story under oath and cross-examination. The truth about the 12 dead soldiers and Blackstone's systematic cover-up had been presented to a military court with the authority to deliver justice. The outcome was now beyond her control, but she had fulfilled her obligation to the soldiers whose deaths had been dishonored by command deception. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon after 3 days of deliberation by the court-martial panel. Elena sat in the front row of the courtroom, her hands folded tightly in her lap as Colonel Roberts prepared to announce the findings that would determine Major Blackstone's fate and validate or destroy months of investigation. The families of the 12 deceased soldiers filled the rows behind her, their faces reflecting a mixture of hope for justice and fear that the military system might once again protect its own at their expense. "Will the accused please rise?" Colonel Roberts commanded, his voice carrying the formal gravity that marked moments of ultimate legal consequence. Major Blackstone stood slowly, his uniform impeccable, despite 3 months of confinement and legal proceedings. Elena could see the tension in his shoulders as he faced the panel of senior officers, who would decide whether he spent the rest of his life in military prison or walked free to rebuild his shattered career. "Members of the court, have you reached findings?" Roberts asked. The senior panel member, Brigadier General Patricia Williams, rose to deliver the verdict. Her weathered face and multiple combat deployments gave her the authority to judge another officer's conduct in the most serious possible circumstances. "We have, Your Honor." Elena held her breath as General Williams opened the official document containing the court's decision. Around her, she could hear the suppressed sobs of mothers who had spent years demanding answers about how their children died, and the quiet prayers of fathers who had never believed official explanations about routine patrol casualties. "On the charge of dereliction of duty, we find the accused guilty," Williams announced, her voice steady and clear. "On the charge of falsification of official records, we find the accused guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the accused guilty." The courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief, anger, and vindication as family members processed the confirmation that their loved ones had been murdered by their own commanding officer. Elena felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that Sergeant Torres and the 11 other soldiers would finally receive the justice they deserved. Blackstone remained standing, his face completely drained of color as the guilty verdicts were read. His defense attorney placed a supportive hand on his shoulder, but Elena could see that he understood the magnitude of his conviction. Military justice for premeditated murder carried the possibility of life imprisonment or execution. "The court sentences the accused to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole," General Williams continued, "with reduction to the grade of private and forfeiture of all pay and allowances." Elena watched as military police officers approached Blackstone to begin his immediate transfer to the military prison at Fort Leavenworth, where he would spend the remainder of his life paying for the soldiers he had murdered. The man who had called her a liability and questioned her mental stability was being led away in handcuffs while she sat free in the courtroom as a vindicated witness. But the court-martial verdict was only the beginning of a transformation that would reshape military accountability procedures and Elena's own role within the service. Within hours of Blackstone's conviction, Secretary of Defense Jennifer Martinez announced a comprehensive review of command authority and oversight procedures designed to prevent similar cover-ups in future operations. Elena was summoned to a meeting at the Pentagon 2 weeks later, where she found herself seated across from senior officials who had previously been names in organizational charts rather than real people with faces and personalities. The conference room overlooked the Potomac River, its windows offering a view of the monuments that honored previous generations of American military service. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," Secretary Martinez began, "your investigation and testimony have exposed systematic failures in our accountability mechanisms that could have continued indefinitely without your intervention. The Department of Defense is prepared to offer you several options for continuing your military service." Elena had expected this conversation but remained uncertain about what path would best serve her desire to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The publicity surrounding the court-martial had made her a recognizable figure within military circles, someone whose name was associated with both extraordinary competence and willingness to challenge corrupt authority. "Ma'am, I'm honored by the department's confidence and prepared to serve wherever I can be most effective in protecting soldier welfare," Elena replied, using the formal language that serious military conversations required. General Martinez consulted her notes, which Elena could see contained detailed assessments of various assignment options that had been developed by personnel specialists and strategic planners. "We're prepared to offer you immediate promotion to warrant officer with assignment to the Inspector General's office, where you would investigate similar cases of misconduct and systemic failures." The offer represented a dramatic advancement in responsibility and authority, transforming Elena from a warehouse worker to a senior investigator with the power to examine command decisions at the highest levels. It would also place her in a position to ensure that the sacrifice of Torres and the other 11 soldiers resulted in meaningful reform rather than cosmetic changes. Alternatively, Martinez continued, we can reinstate you to flight status as a commissioned officer and assign you to a position where your combat experience and tactical knowledge can contribute to training and operational planning. Elena appreciated both options, but her experience over the past months had convinced her that the greatest need lay in preventing future cover-ups rather than returning to traditional military roles. Ma'am, I believe I can best serve by accepting the Inspector General assignment and working to ensure that no other soldiers die due to command failures that are subsequently concealed. Within 60 days, Elena found herself wearing the insignia of Chief Warrant Officer and occupying an office in the Pentagon that gave her access to personnel files, operational records, and investigative resources that spanned the entire Department of Defense. Her first case involved examining casualty reports from Iraq that showed patterns similar to what she had discovered at Fort Blackwood. The investigation revealed another conspiracy involving unauthorized operations and concealed casualties, this time involving a lieutenant colonel who had been ordering special operations missions without proper oversight or support. Elena's methodology, refined through her original investigation of Blackstone, quickly identified the documentary evidence and witness testimony needed to expose the cover-up. Chief Warrant Officer Vasquez, her supervisor, Colonel David Park, observed during a briefing on the Iraq investigation, "Your investigative techniques are unlike anything we've seen in traditional military criminal investigation. You approach evidence analysis like a detective rather than a soldier." Elena had developed her methods through necessity rather than formal training, learning to recognize patterns and connect seemingly unrelated pieces of information through months of unauthorized research. "Sir, my combat experience taught me to observe details that others might miss and to trust evidence over explanations when they contradict each other." The success of her investigations led to Elena being assigned increasingly complex cases that involved multiple commands and extensive documentation review. She discovered that the problems exposed by Blackstone's court-martial were not isolated incidents but symptoms of systemic failures in accountability and oversight that affected military operations worldwide. On counts, her office became a destination for whistleblowers, concerned soldiers, and family members who suspected that official explanations for casualties didn't match the evidence they had observed. Elena's reputation for thorough investigation and willingness to challenge senior officers created a network of sources that provided information about misconduct throughout the military hierarchy. The transformation extended beyond Elena's individual career to broader changes in military culture and procedures. The Vasquez Protocol, as it became known informally, required independent verification of casualty reports and mandatory review of any patterns suggesting unauthorized operations. Commands could no longer conduct high-risk missions without proper documentation and oversight. Elena also became a sought-after instructor at military leadership schools, where she taught courses on ethical decision-making and the importance of protecting subordinates from command failures. Her classes consistently drew overflow crowds of officers who wanted to learn from someone who had demonstrated both tactical competence and moral courage under the most challenging circumstances. "The most important lesson I can share," Elena would tell her students, "is that competence includes the courage to question authority when lives are at stake. Military hierarchy exists to accomplish missions and protect soldiers, not to protect incompetent leaders from accountability." The families of the 12 murdered soldiers remained in contact with Elena, their gratitude serving as a constant reminder of why her investigation had been necessary despite the personal and professional risks involved. She attended memorial services, corresponded with parents and siblings, and ensured that the true circumstances of their deaths were preserved in official records rather than buried under convenient lies. Elena's transformation from invisible warehouse worker to senior investigator represented more than individual advancement. It demonstrated that competence and integrity could triumph over corruption and cover-up when someone possessed the courage to act on their convictions regardless of personal consequences. 2 years after Major Blackstone's conviction, Elena stood before a graduating class of infantry officers at Fort Benning, her chief warrant officer insignia, catching the morning sunlight that streamed through the academy's tall windows. The young faces looking back at her represented the future of military leadership, officers who would soon be responsible for the lives and welfare of soldiers serving in harm's way around the world. Leadership is not about the authority that comes with rank, Elena began, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had developed through years of investigation and testimony. True leadership is about the responsibility you accept when you put on the uniform and take command of soldiers who trust you with their lives. Among the graduating officers sat Lieutenant Jennifer Park, the young woman Elena remembered from her first days as a flight instructor years earlier. Park had followed Elena's career transformation and had specifically requested assignment to units where she could implement the accountability procedures that Elena's investigations had inspired throughout the military. Elena's office at the Pentagon had evolved into something resembling a war room, its walls covered with organizational charts, case timelines, and photographs of soldiers whose deaths had been investigated through the protocols she had developed. Each completed investigation represented lives saved through improved oversight and commanders held accountable for their decisions. "Ma'am, we've received another whistleblower complaint from Fort Carson," announced Captain Michael Chen, Elena's assistant investigator, as he entered with a secure communication device. "A sergeant is reporting unauthorized night operations that resulted in 3 casualties last month." Elena reviewed the initial allegations, immediately recognizing patterns that had become familiar through dozens of similar cases. Commanders continued to attempt unauthorized operations, but the oversight mechanisms she had helped design were now catching most of them before they could evolve into systematic cover-ups. The investigation at Fort Carson revealed a captain who had been conducting unsanctioned reconnaissance missions in an attempt to gather intelligence that would enhance his performance evaluations. Unlike Blackstone's systematic deception, this case involved incompetence rather than premeditated murder, but Elena's intervention prevented what could have developed into another tragic pattern of concealed casualties. Chief Warrant Officer Vasquez, Colonel Park, observed during their weekly case review, "Your investigative success rate approaches 100%. How do you consistently identify misconduct that other investigators miss?" Elena had reflected on this question many times, trying to understand what combination of experience and instinct allowed her to recognize deception in official reports and command explanations. "Sir, my combat experience taught me that survival depends on recognizing when something doesn't feel right, even when you can't immediately explain why." The lesson applied equally to examining casualty reports, equipment inventories, and communication logs. Elena had learned to trust her instincts when evidence suggested that official explanations didn't match observable facts, regardless of how convincing the documentation appeared or how senior the officers providing the explanations. Elena's reputation had made her a target for officers who resented accountability and oversight, but it had also attracted support from soldiers throughout the military who appreciated having someone with the authority and commitment to investigate command failures. Her email inbox received hundreds of messages weekly from personnel reporting suspicious patterns or requesting guidance on how to address concerns about leadership misconduct. The families of Torres and the 11 other soldiers remained Elena's most important constituency. She corresponded regularly with parents and siblings, updating them on the broader reforms that had resulted from their loved ones' sacrifice, and ensuring that their deaths continued to serve as motivation for preventing similar tragedies. "Elena," wrote Maria Torres, Sergeant Michael Torres's mother, "thank you for giving my son's death meaning. He always believed that soldiers should protect each other, and you've made sure his sacrifice protects future generations of American troops." Elena kept this letter framed on her office wall, along with similar messages from other families whose grief had been transformed into purpose through the accountability reforms that emerged from the Blackstone investigation. Their gratitude served as daily reminder that her decision to risk court-martial had achieved something far beyond exposing a single corrupt officer. As Elena looked out her Pentagon window at the monuments honoring previous generations of American military service, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that morning, when Major Blackstone had called her a liability unfit for continued military service. The warehouse worker, who had been dismissed as mentally unstable, was now responsible for investigating command failures throughout the world's most powerful military organization. The transformation proved that competence and integrity could triumph over prejudice and corruption when combined with the courage to act despite personal risk. Elena Rodriguez had not just exposed a cover-up that killed 12 soldiers, she had changed the culture of an entire institution, ensuring that future generations of military leaders would be held accountable for their decisions, and that no soldier would die due to command failures that were subsequently concealed from public scrutiny. 5 years after her investigation began in that dusty warehouse at Fort Blackwood, Elena received an invitation that brought her full circle. The Secretary of the Army requested her presence at the dedication of the Torres Memorial Garden at Fort Benning, a permanent tribute to the 12 soldiers whose deaths had sparked the most significant military accountability reforms in decades. Elena arrived at the ceremony wearing her dress blue uniform, now bearing the insignia of Major and decorated with ribbons that reflected her unique career trajectory from combat veteran to investigator to senior leader. The Memorial Garden occupied a prominent location near the Infantry Museum, ensuring that future generations of soldiers would remember the price of leadership failures and the importance of accountability. The families of all 12 soldiers had traveled from across the country to attend the dedication. Elena watched as Maria Torres, now gray-haired but still carrying herself with the dignity of someone who had transformed personal tragedy into public service, approached the bronze plaque bearing her son's name and service record. "Major Vasquez," Maria said, embracing Elena with the warmth of someone who had become family through shared struggle. "Michael would be proud to know that his death prevented others from suffering the same fate." Elena had remained in close contact with all the families, providing regular updates on how their loved one's sacrifice had contributed to ongoing reforms in military oversight and command accountability. Their support had sustained her through the most challenging periods of her investigation and the subsequent years of implementing systematic changes. General Sarah Williams, now the Army Chief of Staff, delivered the dedication address to an audience that included hundreds of active-duty soldiers, military families, and civilian officials who had supported the reform efforts. The soldiers memorialized here died not just serving their country, but exposing failures that threatened the integrity of our entire institution. Elena's current assignment as Director of Military Accountability Operations had evolved from her original Inspector General role into something entirely new within the Department of Defense structure. Her office now employed dozens of investigators, data analysts, and oversight specialists who applied the methodologies she had developed to identify patterns of misconduct before they could result in casualties. "Ma'am, we've successfully prevented 17 unauthorized operations this year alone," reported Colonel Lisa Thompson, Elena's deputy director, during their monthly briefing. "The early warning systems you designed are catching command failures before they can evolve into systematic cover-ups." The success metrics represented more than bureaucratic achievements. They represented lives saved and families spared the grief that had motivated Elena's original investigation. Each prevented casualty validated the decision to risk her career by challenging corrupt authority and exposing systemic failures. Elena's influence extended beyond military circles into academic institutions, where her case studies were taught in leadership courses and ethics programs. The Vasquez model of institutional accountability had been adopted by law enforcement agencies, corporate compliance departments, and government oversight organizations that faced similar challenges in preventing abuse of authority. During her speaking engagements at universities and professional conferences, Elena consistently emphasized that extraordinary circumstances required ordinary people to make extraordinary choices. "Leadership isn't about rank or position," she would tell audiences. "It's about accepting responsibility for doing what's right, even when the system makes it difficult or dangerous." The Memorial Garden dedication concluded with Elena placing a wreath at the base of the monument, her hands trembling slightly as she read the names of soldiers whose deaths had changed her life and career in ways she never could have anticipated. Sergeant Michael Torres's name led the list, followed by the 11 other soldiers whose sacrifice had exposed the corruption that threatened military integrity. As Elena stood in silent tribute, she reflected on the journey that had transformed her from an invisible warehouse worker into a senior leader responsible for protecting soldiers throughout the world's largest military organization. The path had required courage, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to truth over convenience, but it had ultimately proven that individual action could create institutional change when motivated by genuine concern for others' welfare. The dedication ceremony represented not an ending but a continuation of the mission that had begun with her discovery of Sergeant Torres's journal among misfiled equipment returns, a reminder that vigilance and accountability remained essential to preventing future tragedies. Elena's legacy crystallized during her final year of active duty as she prepared to transition from military service to civilian leadership roles. The Pentagon office that had served as headquarters for her accountability reforms was being transformed into a permanent military integrity center, ensuring that the investigative methodologies she had developed would continue protecting soldiers long after her retirement. Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Park, now Elena's designated successor, had spent 3 years learning the investigative techniques and institutional knowledge that Elena had accumulated through hundreds of cases and thousands of hours examining patterns of command failure. Park represented the new generation of military leaders who had grown up understanding that accountability was not optional but essential to maintaining the trust between commanders and their soldiers. "Ma'am, the Congressional Defense Committee has requested your testimony regarding the proposed Military Accountability Act," Park informed Elena during their final joint briefing. "They want your professional assessment of whether the legislative reforms will effectively prevent future cover-ups." Elena reviewed the proposed legislation, recognizing provisions that had emerged directly from her investigations and recommendations over the past 5 years. The bill would codify many of the informal procedures she had developed, creating legal requirements for independent verification of casualty reports and mandatory oversight of any operations that deviated from approved mission parameters. During her congressional testimony, Elena faced questions from senators who had initially resisted military reforms, but now recognized the political necessity of addressing systemic accountability failures. Her measured responses and detailed knowledge of specific cases gradually convinced skeptical committee members that the proposed legislation represented practical solutions rather than bureaucratic expansion. Major Vasquez asked Senator Robert Hayes, "In your professional opinion, could the deaths of those 12 soldiers have been prevented if these accountability measures had been in place 5 years ago?" Elena considered the question carefully, knowing that her answer would influence how Congress approached military oversight funding and authority. "Senator, the systemic changes we've implemented would have identified Major Blackstone's unauthorized operations within weeks rather than allowing them to continue for months. Early intervention would have prevented those deaths and many others." The Military Accountability Act passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, transforming Elena's investigative protocols from informal procedures into federal law. The legislation represented the culmination of her 5-year campaign to ensure that command failures could no longer be concealed through systematic deception and intimidation. Elena's retirement ceremony took place at Arlington National Cemetery, where she had requested that the event honor not her individual achievements, but the soldiers whose deaths had made accountability reforms necessary. The simple ceremony reflected her belief that true leadership operated through example rather than recognition, creating lasting change through competence and integrity rather than publicity and politics. As Elena removed her uniform for the final time, she reflected on the unexpected trajectory that had transformed her from an overlooked warehouse worker into a senior leader whose reforms had protected thousands of soldiers worldwide. Her story proved that extraordinary impact often emerged from ordinary people who possessed the courage to act on their convictions when institutional failures threatened the welfare of those they were sworn to protect. 10 years later, Elena walked through the halls of the Military Accountability Institute, the civilian organization she had founded to continue monitoring defense contractors and military operations worldwide. The walls displayed photographs of the hundreds of soldiers whose lives had been saved through early intervention programs that detected command failures before they became tragedies. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lieutenant Colonel Park, now commanding the Enhanced Oversight Division Elena had created. Another prevented casualty in Syria. Commander attempted unauthorized raid but was stopped by accountability protocols. Thank you for building the system that keeps working. Elena smiled, knowing that somewhere a family would never experience the grief that had motivated her original investigation. The ripple effects of her decision to challenge Major Blackstone continued expanding, protecting soldiers she would never meet and preventing cover-ups she would never investigate. At her desk, Elena opened her laptop to find an email from Maria Torres. "Elena, my grandson just enlisted in the Army. I'm not worried about him the way I worried about Michael, because I know you built a system that will protect him. Thank you for making sure my son's death meant something." Elena looked out her office window at the Pentagon across the river, where new investigators were applying the methodologies she had developed to protect the next generation of American soldiers. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez had started as a dismissed warehouse worker, investigating suspicious equipment records. Major Elena Rodriguez had retired as the architect of military accountability reforms that would protect soldiers for decades to come. Her story proved that one person with courage, competence, and unwavering commitment to truth could transform an entire institution and save countless lives. What hidden talents are you developing that could change everything when the moment comes? Share your story in the comments below and subscribe to join our community of everyday heroes who refuse to accept injustice. Your voice matters, and your story could inspire the next person to take that crucial stand.